Welcome to the Chapter 9 lecture for Management 3120 Operations Management course. I am Dr. Bill Perkins, and I am going to provide you a video lecture based on the material found in the textbook Practical Operations Management, 2nd edition, from Natalie Simpson and Philip Hancock. So our objectives for this chapter is to define supply chains, selecting supply chain partners, and understand what is involved in purchasing from partners. So let's get started. By definition, supply chains connect individual businesses into networks that provide consumers with goods and services. Multiple suppliers, manufacturers, and/or service providers may be involved in any product, with each business relying on other suppliers and providers, resulting in a network of linked relationships that can grow quite complex. And figure 9.1 on this slide illustrates the supply chains for 10 rival automotive manufacturers and their respective major suppliers. Note how the high number of suppliers shared by these manufacturers creates a single tangled network. And figure 9.2 on this slide illustrates a simplified supply chain, presenting terminology helpful when navigating these networks. Organizations and activity positioned between a business and the end customer of a product are said to be downstream of that business. And figure 9.2 positions its labels from the manufacturer's viewpoint so that the distributor is logistically downstream. So for definition purposes, downstream refers to the closeness to the end customer in the supply chain. In contrary to the distributor, the retailer in figure 9.2 would consider the distributor to be an upstream partner. So for definition purposes, upstream is the closeness to the supplier in the supply chain. Inbound logistics connect an organization to its first tier or tier 1 suppliers, the businesses from which it purchases the materials and support it needs to participate in the supply chain. And so for definition purposes, a tier 1 supplier is an organization's immediate supplier. These first-tier suppliers are then likely to rely on their first set of Tier 1 suppliers, which become the Tier 2 suppliers to the original organization. So for definition purposes, a Tier 2 supplier is the supplier of an organization's immediate supplier. While the boxes in figure 9.2 represent organizations, arrows symbolize flow of goods and services. Some arrows represent the outbound logistics for a sending organization. So outbound logistics refers to the management of logistical flow departing a facility or other system. Other arrows represent the inbound logistics for a receiving organization. So inbound logistics refers to the management of logistical flow into a facility or other system. Almost all transactions governing the logistical flow suggested in figure 9.2 would be called business-to-business or B2B activity. In fact, all non-consumer supply chain members in figure 9.2 could be called B2B suppliers, with the exception of the retailer, whose role in this supply chain is business to consumer. So business to business refers to commercial transactions between organizations. And business to consumer is commercial transactions between an organization and individual consumers. Supply chain frameworks are reference models that provide a common language for supply chain ideas, methods, and activities, and enable comparison of current operations with best practice benchmarks. Adopting a reference model is particularly critical to supply chain management because of its interdisciplinary nature, requiring people from purchasing and procurement to work closely with many other parts of the organization and for differing organizations to work well together. A supply chain framework should establish a common language of clear and consistent supply chain terminology. Should also communicate the supply chain management strategy to everyone in the organization. It should allow stakeholders to align with the corporate strategy and measure the effectiveness of their own actions. And it should also facilitate a cross-functional view of the organization consistent with enterprise resource planning, which is a strategic information system that integrates all functional areas of an organization. It should also enable measured, process-focused continuous improvement with industry best practices as performance targets. So the supply chain operations reference, the SCORE model, was developed by a professional organization now known as the Apex Supply Chain Council. So figure 9.3 on this slide outlines this detailed reference scheme, which is organized into 3 levels of analysis. At its highest level, an organization has 5 broad types of management processes. The first is to plan, the second is to source, the third is to make, fourth is to deliver, and the fifth is to return, the return. Any one of these types can be broken down into categories or choices of configuration as pictured on level 2. In this illustrated framework, you are choosing between build to order or build to stock. And any of the configurations in level 2 can be broken down to a component business processes on level 3, where in this illustrated framework we are looking at production scheduling, and packaging. One of the key objectives in the SCORE model, which wasn't visible in figure 9.3, is that the framework supports supply chain performance measurement by developing a common set of metrics used for benchmarking, which involves measuring performance relative to some peers' performance, generally identified as best in class. These are also the shared best practices you'll hear about in information sharing between organizations. Most supply chain frameworks require some degree of benchmarking. Benchmarking first requires a search to identify industry-wide best practices to then compare an individual organization's performance metrics with those best-in-class organizations. Benchmarking metrics can help identify gaps in an organization's current performance to prioritize plans for involvement and to drive the ongoing value creation process. In today's competitive world, it is also important for procurement professionals to justify their use of resources by demonstrating procurement's value, and benchmarking is a good way to do this. Once convenient source of such benchmark is in the cross-industry report of standard benchmarks, which is known as CAPS. It's published biannually. This report provides an updated list of 21 commonly referenced procurement benchmarks organized by industry. So we're going to start discussing some examples of the key indicators published by CAPS, which include supply chain or supply management operating expense as a percentage of total spend, As examples, this percentage should be around 0.4% for chemical manufacturing, or as high as 2.4% for engineering and construction to be considered world class. Next, we have supply management return on investment, and this shows the contribution made by purchasing to the company's bottom line. The benchmarks range from 318% in aerospace to 1,397% in financial services. Moving on, we have supply chain management operating expense per supply management employee. Examples of the world-class benchmarks range from $115,000 in engineering and construction to $160,000 in chemical manufacturing. Average purchase order processing out. Overall, the average purchase order costs $411 to process. Moving on to percentage of active suppliers that account for 80% of total spend. On average, 80% of purchases are acquired from only 5.8% of an organization's suppliers. And finally, we have the percentage of total spend managed, controlled by supply management. This shows the amount of organizational spending directly controlled by procurement, averaging at 85.5%. Looking upstream, strategic supply chain management begins with an understanding of what must be purchased there. A spend analysis reveals what the organization has been purchasing previously and from whom. One of the objectives of this report is to determine whether any goods or services would benefit from consolidation into larger categories of purchasing to pursue savings when approaching a supplier upstream. Now, grouping individual purchases together to create buying power, such as consolidating all purchases of milk, butter, and cheese into dairy products, creates the foundation of a commodity or category plan. Commodity/category planning continues by considering how each purchasing category should be managed in the future, using tools such as supplier positioning and supplier preferencing. Supplier positioning classified purchasing to gain better insight into how each category should be managed by the buyer organization. Graphing the cost of purchasing relative to its total risk creates the supplier positioning matrix. And figure 9.4 on this slide and the next few slides illustrates the labels with each of the four classifications into which any purchasing category might fall. Across the horizontal axis of figure 9.4, the annual expense of purchasing measures the influence this purchasing has on the overall profitability of the buying organization. This issue alone is used to prioritize attention to purchasing in a simpler ranking scheme known as the ABC policy. However, supplier positioning also recognizes the vulnerability of the supply determined by a variety of factors that can include limited availability and shortages of the item being purchased, the reliability of delivery, the number of potential suppliers, and even environmental concerns. Although the top quadrants are circled by the publisher, we're going to first concentrate on the lower quadrants. Purchases positioned in the lower bottom left-hand quadrant are described as tactical acquisitions, being of both low value and low risk. A minimum amount of time should be spent on purchasing in this category because there is little benefit to focusing energy on these items. Items in the bottom right quadrant, the tactical profit category, are relatively high value, but their low risk implies the presence of several competitive suppliers. So the buying organization should focus on leveraging its purchasing power when selecting a supplier. Purchases in the top left quadrant, described as strategic security, are of lower monetary value but do represent a critical risk to the organization. So the objective here should be to ensure continuity of supply even at a premium price and developing relationships with potential suppliers. Finally, strategic critical purchases in the top right quadrant are both high in value and in risk to the organization. These items are the natural focus of the organization, requiring the most time and effort devoted to purchasing decisions, contingency planning, and maintaining close supply chain partnerships. Does a supplier have access to your critical infrastructure? Information technology such as strategic security, even though a business may occasionally spend on installation or repair of communication and information infrastructure, services like this one pictured here are often very prioritized as strategic security. While the expense is not the majority of the business's overall operations, the risk associated with access to information and potential disruption of communication may give the client business reasons to pick an information technology provider carefully and develop an enduring relationship. Are there many suppliers? Border delays in global sourcing, delivery of goods from outside the country is subject to complexity that local sources do not suffer. In most areas, trucks crossing international borders must stop for customs inspections, sometimes adding considerable time to their trip. As a result, the trucks queuing here are a familiar sight in border cities around the world. These trucks are entering Canada from the United States, but their transition through Canadian customs may be further complicated by the fact their cargo can be from anywhere in the world. And why would a supply shortage stop you immediately? When an organization centralizes its buying to save on the cost of some purchases, it must also invest in the ability to safely handle bulk shipments. This includes equipment and skilled operators, such as forklift drivers in the illustration on this slide, as well as sufficient storage space and control methods to keep the inventory organized. Where once the phrase third-party logistics was assumed to mean outsourcing the transportation of goods, increasing numbers of organizations rely on these companies to also manage warehouses and provide all the associated services. The supplier positioning matrix clarifies what strategy a buying organization should adopt for purchasing a certain item or category of items. Before proceeding, that same organization must consider how each supplier in the marketplace might view that same purchasing opportunity. And here in figure 9.5, a supplier positioning matrix, the buyer's potential purchasing is evaluated for its relative value versus its relative attractiveness to a potential supplier, creating 4 different viewpoints that the supplier is likely to take of the buyer. So generally, the value of the buyer's business is determined by factors such as size of the buyer's potential purchasing account, the overall size of the supplier and the number of suppliers competing for that same business. The attractiveness of the buyer's business concerns its potential profitability, which includes issues as varied as the cost of maintaining the buyer's business and the buyer's reputation for on-time payment, whether the supplier believes the buyer's account will grow in the future, and even the perceived prestige of association with the buyer. A supplier whose viewpoint places it within the bottom half of the matrix is generally not a good business match for the buyer. A potential supplier in the bottom left quadrant would consider opportunity of little values relative to its other accounts and relatively unattractive for other reasons, and thus merely a nuisance. So the organization should avoid such a supplier if possible. The bottom right quadrant represents the view that the buyer's business is valuable, but is nonetheless distinctly unattractive, such as requiring tight delivery windows or other unfavorable conditions for the supplier. Here, the buyer should be aware that the supplier would likely view this business as exploitable, asking a high price with little concern for losing the opportunity. The upper half of figure 9.5 represents the better matches to the buyer. A supplier in the top left quadrant would view the buyer as a relatively low value but otherwise high attractive opportunity, so the supplier would likely work hard to develop the buyer's business, at least in the short term. Finally, the best match to the buyer would be located in the top right quadrant, where the buyer's account is considered both a valuable and attractive account to the supplier, who would likely offer a high level of service and work vigorously to retain the buyer's future business. And this is also the most logical group from which the buyer could select candidates for developing strategic alliances and partnerships. The choice between producing a tangible item in-house or outsourcing its production to another company is called make or buy decision. The make or buy decision can arise during new product development if the business is also experiencing capacity difficulties due to high demand for its current products. The exact steps in a generic procurement process often depend on the value and risk of the goods or services being acquired. The same to issues illustrated in the supplier positioning matrix earlier. So for the strategic security, strategic critical, and tactical profit quadrants, this process generally includes the steps over the next 5 slides, starting with develop specifications. Ideally, these technical specifications should be developed through consultation with all internal stakeholders in the purchase. In some cases, the buying organization may also request information from candidate suppliers concerning what the marketplace can reasonably provide before finalizing its own specifications. Next, we have structure and invitation to tender and a tender evaluation model. This decides the process through which potential suppliers submit tenders, bids to supply the good or service described in the buyer specifications. For large, complex contracts, the buying organization may host pre-tender meetings to discuss these specifications with all interested bidding parties. Now remember, tender refers to a bid or a cost provided to a potential buyer. Now number 3, we have issue the invitation to tender and collect responses. This must be done in a manner that ensures the integrity of the process and communicates equal information in a timely manner to all potential buyers. Widespread advertising of the opportunity also supports multiple tender offers from a greater diversity of organizations. Number 4, we have evaluate tender responses with tender evaluation model. Tenders for large contracts may be evaluated by several different groups internally, such as an engineering team evaluating the technical components, a procurement team evaluating the commercial components, and a finance team researching the apparent financial health of each bidding organization. Our 5th and final step is to select a supplier from among the tender responses, negotiate, and award a contract. So procurement teams usually award, monitor, and manage the finished contract throughout its lifespan with input from those using the contract. In a business world, a contract is the total legal obligations between two or more parties, normally expressed in writing and usually defining goods to be purchased or services to be performed for a certain sum of money. A contract is made when an offer is accepted between two capable parties. Offers may be rejected by the party receiving them, or that party may make a counter offer to the first party to consider. And the linear averaging is the most common method for tender evaluation. In linear averaging, various criteria important to the purchasing organization are identified first, then refined into descriptive categories such as price, quality, and delivery. So linear averaging is a numerically weighted evaluation method used in contracts, selecting locations, or taking or ranking candidates. And this concludes the Chapter 9 lecture. Please log on to Blackboard to look at this chapter's expectations and deliverables, and I will see you in Chapter 10.